The year was 1940. The Battle of Britain was raging, and the Spitfire was the darling of the British public. It was elegant, slender, and maneuverable, a ballerina of the skies. But inside the design offices of Hawker Aviation, Sidney Cam, the man who designed the Hurricane, was working on something entirely different. He wasn't interested in ballerinas. He was building a thug. The Air Ministry had issued a specification for a new interceptor. They wanted something that could fly faster and hit harder than anything currently in the sky. They anticipated that the Germans would soon produce faster bombers and heavier fighters. Cam's answer was the Hawker Typhoon. From the very first blueprints, the aircraft was intimidating. It was massive, weighing nearly 7 tons fully loaded. Standing next to a Spitfire, it looked like a tractor parked next to a sports car. But the heart of this beast was what made it truly terrifying. It wasn't powered by the famous Rolls-Royce Merlin. It needed something stronger. It needed a monster. Enter the Napier Sabre engine. This was an H-block, 24-cylinder liquid-cooled engine. It was essentially 2 flat 12 engines stacked on top of each other, geared together to drive a single massive propeller. While the Merlin pumped out 1,000 horsepower, the Sabre promised over 2,000. It was an engineering marvel of immense complexity, a dense block of metal that roared with a sound unlike anything else in the RAF. When a Typhoon started its engine, it didn't purr. It sounded like a tearing of canvas, a chaotic, metallic thunder that shook the ground. Mechanics reported that the vibration was so intense it would make their teeth rattle standing 20 feet away. The design featured a massive chin radiator located directly under the propeller to cool this behemoth. This gave the Typhoon a distinctive, aggressive profile. It looked like it had a mouth, gaping open, ready to swallow the air in front of it. But building a plane around such a massive engine created immediate problems. The fuselage had to be incredibly thick to accommodate it. The wings had to be thick to hold the heavy armament and fuel. It was a brute. It lacked the grace of its predecessors. Pilots used to the sensitive controls of a Spitfire climbed into the Typhoon and felt like they were strapping themselves into a runaway train. It was fast, blindingly fast. In level flight, it could touch 400 miles per hour, a speed that was unheard of at low altitudes. But speed wasn't enough. A fighter plane needs to be reliable. It needs to be safe for its own pilot. And in 1941, the Typhoon was neither. As the first prototypes took to the air, the monster began to show its teeth, and not just to the enemy. It was about to earn a reputation that would nearly kill the project before it even saw combat. The debut of the Typhoon was not a triumph. It was a disaster. As the first squadrons took delivery of the new aircraft, a series of mysterious and horrifying accidents began to plague the fleet. Pilots would take off for routine patrols and simply never return. There were no distress calls, no reports of enemy contact. They just vanished. Wreckage analysis began to reveal a chilling pattern. The Typhoon's tail section was structurally weak. When the aircraft entered a high-speed dive, the very maneuver it was built for, the buffeting forces caused by the thick wings created a violent airflow over the tail. Without warning, the entire rear fuselage would snap off. Imagine the horror of the pilot. One moment, you are diving at 450 miles per hour. The next, the controls go limp, the world spins violently, and the back half of your plane is gone. Survivability was near zero. The G-forces generated by the disintegration usually pinned the pilot to the cockpit, making bailing out impossible. But the structural failures were only half the nightmare. The massive Napier Sabre engine, for all its power, was leaking. Exhaust fumes were seeping into the cockpit. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer, was slowly poisoning the pilots during long flights. Men were landing their planes in a daze, stumbling out of the cockpit with splitting headaches and nausea. Some didn't land at all. They simply passed out at the stick and flew into the ground. The pilots began to dread the order to fly. They called it the tiffy, but the affection was thin. They knew the machine was trying to kill them. The cockpit doors were cast-iron, requiring the pilot to wind down the window to open the latch. In an emergency, this was a death sentence. If the fuselage warped in a crash, the door jammed, trapping the pilot inside a burning wreck. And burn it did. The Sabre engine was notoriously temperamental. It was prone to catching fire on startup. It was prone to catching fire in flight. The Air Ministry was furious. They had poured millions into this project, and what they had was a widowmaker. There was serious talk in Whitehall of cancelling the entire program. The Spitfire Mark IX was on the horizon, and the American Mustang was showing promise. Why keep this heavy, dangerous, defective beast? The Typhoon was on the brink of being scrapped. It was viewed as a failure of engineering, a waste of resources. But the war does not wait for perfection. Just as the axe was about to fall on the Typhoon, a new threat appeared across the channel. A threat that the Spitfire couldn't handle. The Typhoon was a broken sword, but it was the only heavy weapon the RAF had left to swing. In late 1941, the Luftwaffe unleashed a shock to the RAF, the Focke-Wulf 190. Dubbed the Butcherbird, it was faster, more heavily armed, and rolled faster than the Spitfire Mark V. It was superior in almost every metric. The Germans began a campaign of tip-and-run raids. FW-190s would streak across the English Channel at treetop height, drop bombs on coastal towns, and turn back for France before the British radar could even register them. The Spitfires were useless against this. By the time a Spitfire scrambled and climbed, the Germans were already halfway home. The Spitfire was too slow at sea level to catch the Focke-Wulfs. Desperation set in. The RAF looked at their inventory. They needed something with raw, low-altitude speed. They looked at the Typhoon. Despite its flaws, despite the tails falling off, despite the fumes, the Typhoon had one redeeming quality. Down on the deck, under 5,000 feet, it was a rocket ship. The Sabre engine, which struggled in the thin air of high altitude, gulped the dense air at sea level and produced prodigious power. The RAF scrambled to fix the structural issues. They bolted steel plates around the tail joint, a crude, ugly fix, but it kept the tail on. They gave the pilots oxygen masks to wear from takeoff to landing to counter the carbon monoxide. Then, they sent them hunting. Typhoon squadrons were moved to the southern coast. Their orders were simple: catch the FW-190s. The first encounters were a revelation. German pilots, used to outrunning Spitfires with ease, would look over their shoulders and see a massive, thick-winged shape gaining on them. The Typhoon could do 405 miles per hour at sea level. The FW-190 could only manage about 355 miles per hour. The hunter became the hunted. Typhoon pilots discovered that if they caught the Germans, the heavy armament of 420mm Hispano cannons tore the Focke-Wulfs apart. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. The Typhoon didn't turn with the FW-190. It simply ran it down and blasted it out of the sky. For the first time, the Typhoon crews felt a surge of pride. They were the only ones who could stop the tip-and-run raiders. The citizens of southern England cheered when they saw the distinctive, heavy shapes roaring over their rooftops. They knew that Tiffies were the only shield they had against the sudden bombings. But this success was limited to a very specific envelope: low altitude, high speed, straight lines. The RAF leadership, encouraged by this, made a mistake. They thought the Typhoon was ready for the offensive. They sent it across the channel to sweep for fighters. They sent the brute up to 25,000 feet to challenge the Luftwaffe on their own turf. It was a decision that would lead to humiliation. When the Typhoon squadrons began operating over occupied France in 1942 and 1943, they inevitably encountered the main force of the Luftwaffe at higher altitudes. The results were embarrassing. Above 15,000 feet, the Typhoon's performance fell off a cliff. The thick wings, which provided such structural strength, created immense drag in the thinner air. The climb rate became sluggish. The agility, never great to begin with, vanished completely. German pilots in Bf-109s and FW-190s couldn't believe their luck. They would spot a formation of Typhoons laboring below them, struggling to gain altitude. To the German aces, the Typhoon looked like a fat, clumsy duck. They mocked it. They called it a truck. They joked that the British had forgotten how to build fighter planes. Combat reports from the Luftwaffe described the Typhoon as an easy kill at altitude. All a German pilot had to do was climb. The Typhoon couldn't follow. If a Typhoon pilot tried to turn with a Bf-109 at 20,000 feet, he would stall. The heavy engine would drag the nose down, and the plane would tumble. The Germans felt safe. They treated the Typhoon with contempt. As long as they stayed high, the British brute couldn't touch them. This reputation filtered back to the RAF. The failure label returned. The Typhoon was useless as an escort fighter. It couldn't protect bombers because it couldn't fly high enough to stay with them. It seemed the Typhoon was destined to be a niche aircraft, a coastal defender and nothing more. But while the Germans laughed at the Typhoon's clumsiness in the stratosphere, they failed to notice what was happening closer to the ground. A few visionary squadron leaders were realizing that the Typhoon's high-altitude failure was irrelevant to its true calling. They stopped looking up at the bombers and started looking down at the ground. They saw trains. They saw convoys. They saw airfields. They realized that the thick wing, the cause of all their high-altitude woes, was actually a blessing in disguise. It was strong. Incredibly strong. It was strong enough to carry a load that would break the wings off a Spitfire. The mockery of the German pilots was about to be silenced, not by an air-to-air victory, but by a transformation that would rewrite the rules of ground support. The Typhoon was about to stop trying to be a fighter. It was about to become a predator. The transformation began with a man named Roland Beaumont. He was a test pilot and squadron leader who saw potential where others saw failure. He argued that the war wasn't just being fought at 30,000 feet. It was being fought on the roads, the railways, and the bridges of Europe. The army needed air support. They needed a plane that could get down in the mud with them, fly under the weather, and smash the obstacles in their path. The Typhoon was perfect for this. It was fast at low level, making it hard for anti-aircraft gunners to track. It was rugged, able to take hits and keep flying. And it had that massive engine to haul ordnance. First, they added bomb racks. The wings were fitted to carry 2 500-pound bombs. Suddenly, the Typhoon was carrying a bomb load equivalent to a light bomber from the start of the war. They called it the Bombphone. The pilots changed their tactics. They stopped patrolling the clouds and started roaming the countryside of France. They flew at 0 feet, skimming over hedges, popping up over treetops to blast a German supply train or a command post. The psychological effect was immediate. German troops, used to being safe behind their lines, suddenly found themselves under attack from an aircraft that appeared out of nowhere. The sheer speed of the Typhoon meant that by the time the sound of the engine arrived, the bombs had already dropped. But bombs were imprecise. You had to dive, release, and pray. Against a tank, a bomb was a blunt instrument. You needed a direct hit to knock out a Tiger or a Panther tank, and hitting a moving tank with a drop bomb was nearly impossible. The Typhoon needed a weapon that was as brutal and direct as the plane itself. The British engineers had been working on a secret projectile, a solid-fuel rocket motor attached to a 60-pound high-explosive warhead. It was crude. It was essentially an iron pipe filled with cordite. It had no guidance system. It aimed where the nose of the plane pointed, but it hit with the force of a naval destroyer shell. When they looked for a plane sturdy enough to mount the launch rails, there was only one candidate. The delicate wings of the Spitfire would twist under the recoil. But the Typhoon was built like a bridge. They bolted the rails under the wings. 4 on each side. 8 rockets total. The beast was about to get its claws. The RP-3 rocket was a terrifying weapon. It was 5 feet long and weighed nearly 100 pounds. When a Typhoon pilot fired a salvo, the effect was apocalyptic. The rockets accelerated instantly, leaving trails of white smoke. They didn't have the precision of a sniper rifle. They had the precision of a shotgun. A salvo of 8 rockets, fired in a dive, would saturate an area the size of a football field with high explosives. If a rocket hit a tank, it didn't just disable it. The kinetic energy combined with the explosive warhead would often rip the turret clean off a 60-ton Tiger tank. It would turn an armored car into unrecognizable scrap metal. The first rocket Typhoon squadrons deployed in late 1943. The pilots, once the laughing stock of the RAF, now walked with a swagger. They weren't fighter pilots anymore in the traditional, gentlemanly sense. They were trade pilots. They were blue-collar destroyers. They didn't wear silk scarves. They wore grime. Their planes weren't polished. They were stained with cordite smoke and oil. The Germans stopped laughing. Reports began to filter back to Berlin from the panzer divisions. Enemy fighter bombers attacking with rockets. Devastating losses. The sound of the Typhoon changed, too. It wasn't just the roar of the Sabre engine anymore. It was the whoosh of the rockets leaving the rails. For a German tanker, that sound became the noise of death. The pilots learned to dive at a steep 60-degree angle. The wind screamed over the canopy. The ground rushed up at 400 miles per hour. The target grew in the gun sight. Press the button. The plane would shudder as the rockets departed. The pilot would pull back on the stick, fighting the G-forces, struggling to clear the trees as the world behind him erupted in flame. This was dangerous work. The flak, anti-aircraft fire, at low level was intense. But the Typhoon could take it. pilots flew back to base with holes in their wings big enough to put a head through. They flew back with cylinders shot out. They flew back with half a tail. But they flew back. The Widowmaker had found its calling. It wasn't a dogfighter. It was a flying tank destroyer. And as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Typhoon was poised to become the spearhead of the assault. The mocked, clumsy giant was about to become the most feared aircraft on the Western Front. By August 1944, the Battle of Normandy had reached its bloody crescendo. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, battered and exhausted, were attempting a desperate retreat eastwards. They were trying to escape a closing trap, a pincer movement by Canadian, British, American, and Polish forces. The only escape route was a narrow gap between the towns of Falaise and Argentan. As the noose tightened, this gap shrank to a few miles wide. Into this bottleneck poured tens of thousands of German soldiers, thousands of vehicles, tanks, horse-drawn artillery, and staff cars. It was here that the Hawker Typhoon delivered its most terrifying performance of the war. The area became known as the Corridor of Death. For the Typhoon pilots of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, the Falaise pocket was not a battle, it was a turkey shoot. The weather, which had saved the Germans so often in the past, cleared. The sun shone down on the French countryside, illuminating the traffic jam of the century. From the cockpit of a Typhoon, the scene below was surreal. The roads were solid black ribbons of vehicles, bumper to bumper, moving at a crawl. The Germans were trapped. They couldn't move off the roads because of the hedgerows and the mud, and they couldn't move forward because of the sheer volume of traffic. The squadrons descended like vultures. The tactics were brutal and systematic. The lead Typhoons would dive and use their rockets or cannons to destroy the vehicles at the front of the column and the rear of the column. This effectively sealed the road, trapping everyone in between. Then, the slaughter began. Pilots described the experience as sickeningly easy. There was no need to aim carefully. You simply pointed the nose of the aircraft at the mass of grey steel and pressed the firing button. Rockets screamed from the rails, slamming into Panther tanks, half-tracks, and trucks. The 60-pound high-explosive warheads turned vehicles into twisted, burning metal. Fuel tanks erupted, sending pillars of oily black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The 20mm cannons were used to strafe the soft targets, the horse-drawn supply wagons and the infantry trying to scramble into the ditches. The psychological terror was absolute. German accounts from the ground describe a scene from hell. The roar of the Sabre engines was constant, a never-ending thunder that signaled death. The air smelled of cordite, burning rubber, and rotting flesh. One Typhoon pilot, Flight Lieutenant Roy Albrighton, recalled flying through the smoke and debris, his windscreen smeared with the oil of exploding tanks. He noted that the anti-aircraft fire, usually so fierce, had largely stopped. The German gunners were either dead or had fled their weapons in terror. The carnage was so extensive that it actually impeded the Allied advance. When British and Canadian troops finally closed the gap and entered the Corridor of Death, they were brought to a halt not by enemy fire, but by the sheer density of the wreckage. Bulldozers had to be brought in to clear a path through the tangled mass of destroyed equipment and corpses. Eisenhower, touring the battlefield days later, remarked that it was one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. While post-war analysis suggested that many of the tanks were actually abandoned by their crews or destroyed by their own men to prevent capture, the Typhoon was the primary cause of the panic. It was the presence of the Typhoon that forced the crews to run. It was the Typhoon that stopped the column. The Falaise Pocket was the graveyard of the German army in the west, and the Hawker Typhoon was the grim reaper that oversaw the burial. The aircraft that had once been mocked as a failure had proven itself to be the most destructive ground attack weapon of the European theatre. The devastation at Falaise was not just a result of brute force, it was the result of a revolutionary leap in communication. To understand why the Typhoon was so effective in 1944, we must look at the invisible web that connected the pilot in the sky to the soldier in the mud. In the early years of the war, air support was a clumsy affair. The Army would request an airstrike on a target. The request would go up the chain of command to a headquarters, then over to the Air Force, and hours later, often too late, planes would arrive. By then, the enemy tank had moved, or the friendly troops had been overrun. The RAF and the Army realized this had to change. They developed the cab rank system, a tactic that turned the Typhoon into an on-call sniper for the infantry. The concept was simple but brilliant. Instead of sitting on the ground waiting for orders, squadrons of Typhoons would take off and circle a holding point just behind the front lines, like taxis waiting in a rank at a train station. They would loiter there, saving fuel, waiting for a call. On the ground, embedded with the forward tank units or infantry companies, was a specialized vehicle. It was usually a Sherman tank or a half-track, but stripped of its main gun and packed with radios. Inside sat an RAF pilot, known as the Forward Air Controller, FAC. This was the crucial link. This wasn't an Army radio operator trying to describe a target. This was a pilot talking to other pilots. He spoke their language. He knew what they could see and what they couldn't. When a British unit hit a German strongpoint, a Tiger tank hidden in a barn, or an 88mm anti-aircraft gun digging in, the tank commander would radio the FAC. The FAC would pick up his microphone and call the cab rank. "Hello, Red Leader. This is Rover 1. I have a target for you. Reference map square 44 Baker. Enemy tank in the tree line, north corner of the field. Mark with red smoke." High above, the Typhoon leader would acknowledge. "Rover 1, Red Leader. Tally-ho. Rolling in." From the moment the request was made to the moment the rockets hit the target, the elapsed time could be as little as 3 minutes. This speed was unprecedented. It terrified the Germans. They were used to having time to reposition after being spotted. Now, the moment they opened fire on British troops, retribution fell from the sky almost instantly. The system required immense trust. The Typhoons were often dropping 1,000-pound bombs or firing rocket salvos within 200 yards of friendly troops. A mistake, a miscalculation of the wind, or a wrong map coordinate meant killing their own men. But the accuracy of the Typhoon pilots, guided by the calm voice of the controller on the ground, was uncanny. They learned to read the battlefield. They learned to spot the colored smoke shells fired by the artillery to mark targets. The cab rank changed the psychology of the Allied advance. British tank crews, who knew their Sherman tanks were inferior to the German Tigers, moved with greater confidence. They knew that if they ran into trouble, they had big friends waiting upstairs. They would often cheer over the radio as they watched the Typhoons peel off from the clouds, diving at 450 miles per hour to smash the obstacle in their path. This integration of air and ground power was the modern way of war. The Typhoon was no longer just an airplane. It was an extension of the artillery, a long-range fist that the Army commander could punch with at will. It solved the Typhoon's range problem. It didn't need to fly far, and maximized its firepower. To fully grasp the impact of the Typhoon, one must look at it through the eyes of the enemy. And no one felt the weight of Allied air superiority more than the legendary Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had spent the war mastering the art of mobile warfare. In North Africa, his panzers had moved with lightning speed, striking and vanishing. But in Normandy, Rommel found his genius paralyzed. He faced a new reality, the Jabo. Jabo was the German slang for jag bomber, fighter bomber. It was a word whispered with dread across the Wehrmacht. And the king of the Jabos was the Typhoon. Rommel reported to Berlin that movement by day had become suicidal. The moment a German column kicked up dust, the Typhoons would appear. This forced the German army to operate almost entirely at night. Supply trucks had to creep along in the dark without headlights. Tanks had to remain hidden under camouflage nets in forests during the day, unable to maneuver or counterattack. The Wehrmacht, the master of the Blitzkrieg, was reduced to a static, cowering force. The psychological stress on German tank crews was immense. They were sitting in thick steel boxes, usually feeling invincible against infantry. But against the Typhoon, the steel was a trap. German veterans spoke of the terrifying sound of the rockets. Unlike a bomb, which whistled, the rockets made a tearing, hissing roar. And they came in clusters. If a Typhoon pilot fired a full salvo of 8 rockets, the dispersion pattern was designed to blanket a tank. Even a near miss could shatter the tracks, crack the optics, or concuss the crew inside. A direct hit would often rip the heavy turret of a Tiger tank completely off the hull. Rommel himself would become a casualty of this air dominance. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was traveling in his open-topped Hawk staff car near the village of St. Foy de Montgomery. He was rushing to the front to try and salvage the crumbling situation. Suddenly, out of the sun, 2 Allied fighters dove on the road. They were Spitfires. Though often mythologized as Typhoons, they were part of the same tactical Air Force web. The lead pilot, Charlie Fox, opened fire. 20mm cannon shells tore into the road and the vehicle. The driver was hit and lost control. The car swerved, hit a tree, and flipped over. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, suffering a fractured skull and severe head injuries. The commander of the German defense in the West was taken out of the war, not by a brilliant tank maneuver or a commando raid, but by the random, omnipresent violence of the tactical air force. It was a symbolic moment. The great general, helpless against the young pilot. The German soldiers called the sky over Normandy the Western Front Plague. They felt abandoned by the Luftwaffe, which was nowhere to be seen. When German planes did appear, the soldiers would often joke bitterly. If the planes are camouflaged, they're British. If they're silver, they're American. If they're invisible, they're ours. The Typhoon was the enforcer of this reality. It denied the Germans the one thing they needed most: mobility. Without the ability to move their panzers to the crisis points, the German defense was doomed to a slow, grinding defeat. The German joke, the fat, thick-winged plane they had mocked in 1942, had become the ultimate silencer. It had turned the tables so completely that the hunters of the Luftwaffe were now hiding in the forests, while the failed British interceptor ruled the daylight. Just days after the near annihilation at the Falaise Pocket, a desperate Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, ordered a suicidal counterattack. The goal was to split the Allied forces by punching west through Mortain towards the American beachhead at Avranches. Hitler believed that by cutting off the Allied supply lines, he could still turn the tide. On August 7, 1944, elements of the German 7th Army, including fresh panzer divisions like the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, launched their offensive. This was to be the last great German armoured offensive in the West, and it was met head-on by the Hawker Typhoon. The attack began under the cover of a thick morning mist, which initially shielded the advancing German tanks. For the first few hours, they made significant gains, pushing back exhausted American infantry. But as the morning wore on, the mist began to burn off, revealing the true scale of the German advance. Columns of Panther and Tiger tanks, followed by infantry and support vehicles, were visible for miles. High above, the cab-rank Typhoons were already circling, waiting for their targets. The forward air controllers, FACs, on the ground, often under direct German fire, called in targets with frantic urgency. Rover 1 to Red Leader. Heavy tanks approaching Hill 314. Engage immediately. The response was immediate and devastating. Typhoons, flying in flights of 4 or 8, peeled off from their holding patterns, diving through the thinning clouds. The roar of their Sabre engines, followed by the terrifying whoosh of the rockets, became the soundtrack to the German counterattack's demise. The Typhoons were relentless. They hit the lead tanks, stopping them cold and creating bottlenecks. Then they systematically worked their way down the columns, turning steel into burning wreckage. The German tanks, designed to fight other tanks, found themselves utterly helpless against attacks from above. Their thick frontal armor was useless against a 60-pound rocket plunging onto the thinly armored engine deck or hitting the turret roof. One particularly fierce engagement centered around Hill 314, held by the American 30th Infantry Division. They were surrounded and subjected to intense German shelling and tank assaults. For 5 days, they held out, constantly calling for air support. And the Typhoons answered. Wave after wave. Pilots would reload their rockets at temporary forward airfields that were often little more than grassy strips, then return to the fight within minutes. They flew until they were exhausted, their planes often riddled with flak holes. The sky over Mortain became a deadly shooting gallery. One squadron alone, No. 263 Squadron, claimed to have destroyed 42 German tanks in a single day. While post-war analysis tempered some of these claims, damage assessment in the heat of battle was notoriously difficult. The impact was undeniable. The Mortain counterattack ground to a halt. The German advance was broken, not by tanks or artillery, but primarily by the sheer, overwhelming power of the Typhoon's rockets. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, famously wrote that the Typhoon's performance at Mortain was magnificent. He credited the Typhoons with halting the German counteroffensive and setting the stage for the final collapse of German forces in Normandy. For the German tankers, Mortain was a brutal awakening. They had always been the masters of the battlefield, their Tiger and Panther tanks instilling fear in the enemy. But now, fear came from above, delivered with precision by an aircraft they had once scoffed at. The Typhoon proved that air power could destroy ground forces on a scale previously unimaginable, turning the tide of a desperate land battle. Mortain cemented its legend as the ultimate tank-killing beast. The success of the rocket Typhoon came at a brutal cost. Flying low, fast, and directly into enemy formations meant they were constantly exposed to the most terrifying weapon on the battlefield, anti-aircraft fire, or flak. The Germans, realizing the existential threat posed by the Typhoons, deployed their flak guns with devastating efficiency. Every road, every bridge, every assembly point was bristling with 20 mm, 37 mm, and the fearsome 88 mm anti-aircraft cannons. For a Typhoon pilot, a ground attack mission was a terrifying ordeal. They would often dive through a storm of tracer fire, black explosions, and deadly shrapnel. The cockpit would fill with the smell of ozone and the rhythmic thud of shells hitting the thick aluminum skin of their aircraft. Pilots were taught to fly a corkscrew pattern on approach and exit, making themselves harder to hit. But often, the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. One pilot, squadron leader Dennis Crowley-Milling, described a mission where he flew straight into a wall of 88 mm shells. His Typhoon shuddered violently, losing half its rudder and taking multiple hits to the engine. Yet, it kept flying, its sturdy construction holding together where a more delicate aircraft would have disintegrated. He managed to limp back to base, his plane a mangled wreck, but himself largely unharmed. The thick wings of the Typhoon, once a source of drag and ridicule, now proved to be its greatest asset. They could absorb an incredible amount of punishment. They were built like bridges, reinforced with heavy spars and thick skin. They were often referred to as armored wings. This ruggedness gave the pilots immense confidence. They knew their plane could take a hit. They could press home an attack, even when the flak was thickest, because they trusted the Tiffy to get them home. The 2,000 horsepower Napier Sabre engine, for all its temperamental nature, also had a reputation for sheer resilience. Pilots often returned with cylinders shot out, oil spewing, and the engine sputtering, yet it would continue to turn the propeller just enough to get them across the channel. The Typhoon's low-altitude speed was also a key factor in its survival. It was incredibly difficult for ground gunners to track an aircraft that was moving at over 400 miles per hour, just above the treetops. Many shells would explode behind them, a testament to their incredible velocity. However, the casualty rates were still high. Many Typhoons simply failed to return, falling victim to a direct hit from an 88 mm shell or being torn apart by sustained 20 mm fire. The average lifespan of a Typhoon pilot was measured in weeks during the intense periods of the Normandy campaign. The German response to the Typhoon's dominance was not just flak. They also brought forward their few remaining operational fighters, the FW-190s, hoping to intercept the ground attack aircraft. But here, too, the Typhoon had an advantage. If an FW-190 tried to engage a Typhoon at low level, the Typhoon's sheer speed and formidable armament made it a dangerous opponent. The pilots, veterans of the butcher bird chasers, knew how to turn the tables on any German fighter that dared to descend into their domain. The Typhoons were not just fighting the German army, they were fighting the entire German defense system. They flew through a gauntlet of steel and fire, day in and day out, to fulfill their mission. Their courage, combined with the brute strength of their aircraft, allowed them to prevail. They turned the flak-ridden skies of Normandy into a no-go zone for anything on the ground, effectively winning the battle for Allied ground forces, one rocket salvo at a time. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, the Hawker Typhoon found itself, much like the Zero, facing obsolescence. The jet age was dawning, and the Typhoon, a magnificent brute of a propeller plane, was already a relic. Its successor, the Hawker Tempest, was faster and more refined, destined to take on the remaining Luftwaffe jet fighters. The Typhoon's active combat career was relatively short, only about 3 years. Yet, in that brief span, it carved out a legacy utterly disproportionate to its troubled beginning. It was not a glamorous aircraft. It wasn't hailed for its beauty or its elegant dogfighting prowess like the Spitfire. Instead, it was admired for its sheer, undeniable effectiveness. The Typhoon became the terror of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers, who had scoffed at the truck in 1942, now reported a palpable sense of dread whenever the distinctive roar of the Sabre engine filled the sky. They knew that engine meant immediate, brutal death from above. The statistics speak for themselves. Typhoon squadrons are credited with destroying an astonishing number of German tanks, armored vehicles, and locomotives. While exact figures are often debated, there is no doubt that the Typhoon accounted for thousands of enemy vehicles, crippling German logistics and armor in the final year of the war. It taught the Allies how to conduct close air support effectively. The cab rank system, perfected by the Typhoon squadrons, became the blueprint for combined arms operations for decades to come, influencing tactics used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. It proved that ground attack aircraft could be integrated so seamlessly into battlefield operations that they became, essentially, flying artillery. For the pilots, the Typhoon was a love-hate relationship. They cursed its leaks, its vibrations, its maintenance demands, and its early habit of shedding its tail. But they loved its power, its speed, its ruggedness, and its ability to absorb punishment and bring them home. It was a fighter that looked after its pilot, even when it didn't look pretty doing it. Sidney Cam, the designer, famously said, "An airplane is not a beautiful object, it's a tool." The Typhoon was the ultimate tool for a brutal job. Today, very few Hawker Typhoons survive. The complex Napier Sabre engine was a nightmare to maintain, and the aircraft itself was notoriously difficult to preserve. Most were scrapped immediately after the war, their work done. The handful that remain are silent testaments to an incredible story of transformation. Visiting one in a museum, one is struck by its imposing size, the massive chin radiator, and the heavy-set wings designed not for grace, but for strength and carrying heavy loads. There's a quiet power about it, an echo of the thunder it once brought to the battlefields of Europe. The Hawker Typhoon began its life as a spectacular failure, a widowmaker mocked by the enemy. It was nearly consigned to history's forgotten aircraft. But through the perseverance of its designers, the courage of its pilots, and a brutal necessity of war, it was reborn. It shed its identity as a flawed interceptor and embraced its destiny as a ground attack beast. It didn't just fight, it obliterated. It shattered German morale and annihilated their armored divisions. The Typhoon never became the elegant sword of the skies. Instead, it became the sledgehammer of the Allied invasion, a true tank-killing beast that earned the grudging respect of its enemies and secured its place as one of the most effective and terrifying aircraft of World War II. Its roar signaled doom, and its rockets delivered a final, decisive blow to the Wehrmacht.